Something that's, kind of bitchy.
Ready to cheek.
Well,
She? I know. It's just, bitchy.
well, first of all, you're a little bitchy. That's next level bitchy.
Welcome to Bitchy History, where we cut through the myths and nostalgia to get to the raw, unvarnished truth about the past. With sharp analysis, a feminist lens, and just the right amount of bitchiness, we're here to show you that history isn't just something to study, it's something to question. Let's get started. Welcome back, everybody. So the other night, I was listening to a live on TikTok while I was playing a video game. It's just the kind of thing I do. And there was this woman who kept going on and on about how offensive it is to compare Putin to Hitler because, and I quote, he hasn't committed a Holocaust. Well, that's debatable in the first place. I'm sure Ukrainians might feel differently, but let's ignore that. I pointed out that the entire point of history is so that we can learn to stop horrible things like the Holocaust before they happen, see the signs and respond to them, not see the signs and say, well, it's not that bad yet, maybe we'll check back later. History isn't meant to be just about the past, which I hope I do a decent job of expressing on this podcast. It's about making sure we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. So today, let's talk about something we're still working to improve. But that might change if companies like Meta get their way. You heard that you can now refer to women as household objects and property on their apps now, right? Anyway, let's move on to today's topic: the history of domestic violence in America. Let's start with a fun fact. 1 in 3 women will experience intimate partner violence in her lifetime. It's like some sort of twisted Oprah giveaway. You get abuse, everyone gets abuse. Okay, it's not funny at all, actually, I know. But here's the thing: domestic violence has been normalized, ignored, and enabled for most of American history. So today we're talking about how we got here, what people have done to fight back, and where the hell we're supposed to go from here. Here's the plan. First, we're looking at colonial era nonsense where men had actual legal rights to beat their wives. Then we'll dive into the 19th century temperance movement where women started fighting back. Next, we're headed into the feminist movements of the 1970s, which gave us the first women's shelters and the Violence Against Women Act. Finally, we will discuss modern challenges and solutions because, surprise, we still haven't solved this. So in colonial America, domestic violence wasn't just ignored, it was kind of expected. English common law gave men the legal right to chastise their wives, and chastise is just a polite way of saying beat the crap out of. Men were seen as the rulers of their home, and women, well, they were just kind of property, right? And what were the women going to do about it? Take their abusive husband to court? Women didn't really have legal standing to testify against their spouses. A major part of this was the old legal issue of coverture, which I've discussed in a previous episode already. After all, how can a woman testify against her husband if she's legally not a separate entity from her husband? But even when there was a court case, it wasn't super likely that the court would find in favor of the victim. Case in point, Bradley v. State, 1824. This guy, Bradley, beat his wife and argued that it was within his rights. The Mississippi Supreme Court said, it's got a point, and maybe tone it down next time a little bit, but we're not going to hold you accountable. It wasn't until Fulgham versus State in 1871 that a court finally said, actually, you know what? No, you can't just beat your wife even a little. Groundbreaking, right? Here's the thing about these so-called legal wins, though. They didn't actually fix anything. Sure, courts were like, maybe don't kill your wife, but the bar was set so low it was practically underground. Women were still trapped in marriages with no way out. Divorce? Forget it. The laws were written by men who didn't want their property, I mean wives, walking away. Strange how the GOP wants to bring back that state of affairs with their attacks on no-fault divorce, right? And the cultural norms? Don't get me started. Women were expected to endure abuse in silence because a good wife doesn't air the family's dirty laundry. Imagine living in a society where your survival depends on keeping your mouth shut and smiling through the pain. The system was stacked against them, and speaking out meant risking everything. Depending on the era, that might mean your home, your kids, or your life. Domestic violence wasn't just a personal issue, it was baked into the structure of society. And if you think it's bad now, it was way worse back then. And for all the not all men bros out there shaking in rage like a chihuahua on crack, I'm not saying that every man was beating their wives, but it certainly wasn't forbidden by society. A woman might get one of the good ones, but it wasn't guaranteed, and if you didn't, too bad, so sad.
Be a lucky bride. He's handsome, he's tall, that is, from side to side, but he's a nice man, a good catch, right? You heard he has a temper. He'll beat you every night, but only when he's sober. So you're all right.
Eventually, things start to shift in the 19th century because of some very pissed off women, which tends to be what causes change all the time. And that brings us to the temperance movement, where women took their first steps towards fighting back. Not with fists, because that would be so unladylike, but with protests, petitions, and okay, occasionally axes. Set the scene. It's 19th century, and alcohol is ruining lives, specifically women's lives. Men are drinking away their wages, coming home drunk, and beating their wives. Fun fact, this is why the temperance movement got its start. It wasn't about being puritanical buzzkills, it was about survival. Okay, not just about being puritanical buzzkills. There was a little of that mixed in there too. Enter the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or the WCTU, founded in 1874. These were women who were done having these issues be ignored. Frances Willard, the leader of this organization, was a total badass. She flipped traditional notions of womanhood on their heads. Her rallying cry was home protection, which sounds kind of cute and domestic, but it was really code for we're coming for your booze and probably your patriarchy. She made it socially acceptable for women to march, speak out, and demand change. The WCTU didn't just sit around drinking tea and gossiping about how violent men were. They hit the streets, organized protests, and shamed saloon owners into closing shop. Imagine groups of women praying and singing hymns outside bars until the owners gave up and poured their liquor into the gutter. It was petty, it was effective, and it was the start of something bigger. But the WCTU wasn't just about alcohol. They had connected the dots between drinking, domestic violence, and women's lack of legal rights. They created the first real safety nets for battered women, temporary shelters, support groups, and even legal assistance. Mother Stewart, one of the movement's OGs, called out abusive husbands in her speeches and fought to protect their victims. She didn't just talk the talk, she walked the walk, marching straight into saloons to demand justice. Eventually, the WCTU would link temperance to suffrage. Their argument? Women needed the vote to protect themselves and their families. After all, how could they stop domestic violence if they can't even pass laws? This wasn't just about alcohol, it was about dismantling the system that let men control everything. Of course, not everyone was thrilled about that, but we'll get to the backlash later. Of course, the WCTU wasn't perfect. For starters, it was overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly Protestant. They didn't exactly roll out the welcome mat for women of color or those from different religious backgrounds. Also, their focus on alcohol sometimes overshadowed the larger issue of systemic abuse. But hey, they were working within the constraints of their time, and for a bunch of 19th century gals, they got a hell of a lot done. Still, let's not sugarcoat it. A lot of people saw these women as moralistic busybodies. Men hated them for obvious reasons, but even some suffragists thought they were doing too much. Susan B. Anthony herself was kind of like, let's focus on one thing, ladies. You're making us all look bad. So where did this all leave us? By the late 19th century, the WCTU had laid the groundwork for future reforms. They got people talking about domestic violence, opened the first shelters, and tied it all to the bigger issues of women's rights in America. It was grassroots activism at its finest, but progress was very slow. Fast forward to the 1950s and 1960s. While the civil rights, anti-war, and women's lib movements were grabbing headlines, domestic violence was still an issue that was lurking around the corner. In 1962, domestic violence cases were shifted to family court, where civil procedures meant that abusers faced fewer consequences than if they assaulted a stranger. Translation: domestic violence was still treated as less of a crime and more of a family squabble. By the early 1970s, feminists said, enough is enough. Women are done tolerating this systemic injustice that is allowing abusers to go unpunished and survivors to suffer in silence. They declared, "We will not be beaten," and sparked the Battered Women's Movement, a grassroots organizing effort that forever changed public consciousness and women's lives. For most of history, domestic violence wasn't a public issue. It was a dirty little secret hidden behind closed doors and protected by a toxic cocktail of patriarchy and religious tradition that taught women to be submissive to their husbands. But in the 1970s, feminists made it political. They argued that domestic violence wasn't just about bad marriages, it was about power, control, and systemic inequality. And they were right. This is where survivor-led activism comes in. Women who had experienced abuse began organizing support groups, sharing their stories, and creating safe spaces. Still, in many cities, married, battered women who left their husbands were denied welfare because their husband's income was still counted against them. Yes, the system actively punished women for leaving their abusers. It makes absolutely zero sense, but systemic sexism never does. These grassroots efforts eventually led to the creation of the first domestic violence shelters. In 1977, New York State provided funding for shelters and allowed married victims to file criminal charges against their abusive spouses. By 1983, there were over 700 shelters across the U.S., serving more than 90,000 women and 130,000 children annually. One of the major problems faced by victims of domestic abuse is the legal system, because boy oh boy, did it need an overhaul. Up until the 1970s, law enforcement treated domestic violence like a private matter. Translation: cops would show up, tell the husband to cool it, and leave the wife to fend for herself. But thanks to feminist activism, that finally started to change. By the 1980s, activists were demanding real legal protections for survivors. Restraining orders became a thing, and laws were passed to criminalize domestic violence. Surprise, we live in a world where it wasn't technically illegal to beat your wife until fairly recently. Progress, I guess, but it was seriously overdue. And then came the big one, the Violence Against Women Act. Signed into law by Bill Clinton, ironic, I know, VAWA created federal funding for shelters, hotlines, and legal aid all the way back in 1994. It also strengthened penalties for abusers and made stalking a crime. It was a game changer, but it wasn't perfect. For instance, it didn't fully address systemic barriers faced by marginalized survivors, leaving many without adequate support. Here's the catch. Laws are only as good as their enforcement. Restraining orders are great if police take them seriously. Shelters are life-saving if they have enough funding. And VAWA? Amazing, but it didn't magically fix systemic problems like racism, classism, and homophobia, which still left many survivors out in the cold. But the real heroes were the survivors. They didn't just benefit from these changes, they made them happen. Women who had experienced abuse were the ones lobbying Congress, running shelters, and sharing their stories in courtrooms. They took their pain and turned it into power. In the 1970s, grassroots organizing brought battered women out of the shadows and into the public eye. Hotlines and crisis centers emerged as lifelines, offering support and safety to survivors who had nowhere else to turn. The mantra of the movement, "We will not be beaten," wasn't just catchy, it was revolutionary. Women who had been silenced for centuries were finally demanding to be heard. The first domestic violence shelters were scrappy as hell. The New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence led the way, starting with grassroots funding and sheer determination. For thousands of survivors, this wasn't just a place to escape to, but a place to rebuild. One of the biggest successes of the battered women's movement was its ability to grow and diversify. Advocacy groups like the New York Asian Women's Center and others began addressing the unique needs of marginalized survivors, including women of color, LGBTQ+ individuals, and immigrants. But it wasn't easy. Many early feminist groups centered on white middle-class experiences, leaving others feeling excluded. It took years of activism to carve out spaces for everyone, and we're still not done. Survivor advocacy didn't just change laws, it changed how we talked about domestic violence too. Before, the question was always sort of, oh, why doesn't she just leave? But thanks to these activists, the narratives have begun to subtly shift towards the idea of why is the abuser allowed to stay? We've still got a long way to go on that, I fully admit, but even a subtle change has had huge implications for public understanding and policy. So we have made progress. Shelters, laws, support systems, all of these are great. But guess what? Domestic violence is still a national crisis. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men experience some form of intimate partner violence in their lifetime. And for many survivors, the system is less of a lifeline and more like quicksand. One major problem is that while domestic violence shelters are life-saving, they're also perpetually underfunded. By the year 2000, New York City alone had increased its shelter capacity to over 1,300 beds, still nowhere enough to meet the growing demand. Survivors are often turned away because there aren't enough beds for them, and many shelters can't provide specialized care for LGBTQ+ survivors, immigrants, or people with disabilities. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound and saying, good luck. Then there's the justice system. Restraining orders? Useful in theory, but enforcement is wildly inconsistent. But Earl walked right through that restraining order and put her in intensive care. And don't even get me started on how race and class affect outcomes. Women of color and low income survivors are often dismissed or outright ignored by police and courts. It's as if the system was built for white middle class women and everyone else was an afterthought. Oh, wait, it was. And to top it all off, let's talk about guns, because, surprise, they make everything worse. When a domestic abuser has access to a firearm, the risk of homicide increases by 500%. 500%. Guns don't just escalate violence, they make it deadly. The Lautenberg Amendment in 1996 was supposed to be a game changer for this. It bans anyone convicted of a misdemeanor domestic violence offense or subject to a restraining order from owning a gun. Strangely enough, most of our police force are still carrying guns, despite the fact that they abuse their spouses at a higher rate than the average for the rest of the public. But that's an entirely separate episode, I think. So while that amendment sounds great, enforcement is patchy at best. States handle everything differently depending upon where you are, and some don't bother enforcing the ban at all, really. And here's the kicker: the law doesn't always cover you if you aren't legally married to your partner. So if your boyfriend is abusive, he might still be able to keep his arsenal. Yeah, 'cause that makes sense. But there is hope. Advocacy groups like Gifford's Law Center are fighting to close those loopholes and push for stronger protections. Their message is clear: domestic abusers and guns don't mix. Period. So here we are in 2025. We've got laws, shelters, and a few innovative ideas, but there's still a lot of work to be done. There was one term that I saw a lot while researching this episode, and it was something called trauma-informed care. It's an approach that recognizes that survivors are carrying more than just physical scars. They're dealing with deep emotional wounds that affect every aspect of their lives. Organizations have begun integrating trauma-informed practices into everything from counseling to law enforcement training. The idea is simple: survivors need compassion, not judgment. It's like saying, hey, we see you, we're here to help. What do you need? And honestly, isn't that the least we can do when history built the system that increased this suffering? Cultural attitudes towards domestic violence have also begun to shift thanks to decades of advocacy, but there is still work to be done. Take marital rape, for example. It wasn't even a crime in all 50 states until 1993. Let that sink in. For centuries, the law literally gave husbands free rein to assault their wives. And while cultural norms are changing, there are still places where old-school patriarchal values hold sway. And more often, we are seeing men online who still hold the views that marriage equals absolute access to sex. And let's not forget about prevention. Schools and community organizations are starting to implement programs that teach kids about healthy relationships, consent, and conflict resolution. The goal is to break the cycle of abuse before it begins. Programs like these might not make headlines, but they're quietly laying the groundwork for a future where domestic violence isn't just managed, it's gone. Innovation isn't just about new laws or fancy programs either. It's about shifting the way we think about domestic violence at every level: personal, cultural, and systemic. And while we've come a long way, there is still so much more to do. So what can we learn from history to guide us into the future? Looking back, it's clear that we've come a long way from the days when domestic violence was just considered discipline. The Women's Christian Temperance Union and the later women's lib movements showed us that grassroots level advocacy works. These efforts led to the creation of shelters, hotlines, and public education campaigns. They turned domestic violence from a taboo subject into a societal issue that demanded attention. Collective action works. The WCTU didn't just pray their way into progress. They organized, protested, and made people pay attention. They might have focused a bit too much on the issue of alcohol, but they realized it was a connected issue. Similarly, the grassroots battered women's movement didn't wait for the government to intervene. Systemic change takes time and a hell of a lot of persistence. The battle to criminalize marital rape didn't succeed until 1993, and the Violence Against Women Act wasn't passed until 1994. But each milestone builds on the last, showing that progress is possible when people refuse to give up. However, history has also shown that progress is fragile and uneven. Enforcement of laws is patchy, and loopholes make it easy for abusers to skirt the law, and even the battered women's movement has its blind spots. So, what can we take from all of this? That progress is possible, but it is not inevitable. Every step forward, from the first domestic violence shelters to landmark laws, was the result of hard work, activism, and relentless advocacy. But history also reminds us that the fight is far from over. Survivors are still falling through the cracks of a system that isn't built to fully support them. If we're going to honor the work of those who came before us, we have to keep pushing for change. Because if there's one thing history has taught us, it's that silence helps the oppressor, action helps the survivor, and there's no room for complacency when lives are on the line. So, what actions and policies can help? I mean, first and foremost, we need more gun laws. And I'm a gun owner myself, so don't get all but the Second Amendment on me. The Lautenberg Amendment was a step in the right direction, but enforcement is too patchy, and abusers too often get their hands on firearms or just never have them taken away in the first place. Domestic abusers and guns are a deadly combination that we need to stop. We also need to fund shelters. They are a lifeline for survivors, but like I said, they are perpetually underfunded and overwhelmed. The future demands fully funded, inclusive shelter systems where no one is turned away. We also can't let right-wing politicians get their way on making it harder for people to procure a divorce. We can't let them push the narrative that taking away guns from domestic abusers is just a slippery slope to full gun grabs. And access to abortion and birth control have to be ensured as well, because reproductive choice is a major part of domestic abuse and control. And here's where you come in, dear listener. You don't have to be a policymaker or a social worker to make a difference. Here are a few simple but impactful ways to help. Donate to or volunteer with your local shelter or advocacy group. These organizations are doing the heavy lifting and can always use more resources. One of the easiest things you can do is when you're having that Marie Kondo inspired spring cleaning, take those clothes to the women's shelter, not to Goodwill. Goodwill doesn't need them. Have you seen the state those stores are in? The women's shelter can do a lot more good with them. Also, contact your representatives and demand action on closing gun control loopholes, increasing funding for shelters, and expanding education programs. I know, it hasn't worked yet, but again, persistence. Use your platforms, social media, your workplace, your community, to educate others about domestic violence and the resources available. And if someone in your life is experiencing abuse, offer support without judgment. Listen to them, believe them, and help them access resources if they're ready. The vision for the future isn't just about fixing what's broken, it's about building a world where domestic violence doesn't happen in the first place. That means better policies, more inclusive advocacy, and a culture that values empathy, accountability, and, god damn it, therapy. It's a big job, but history has shown us that when people come together to demand change, amazing things can happen. Be part of the solution. Whether it's advocating for universal background checks and red flag laws to keep guns out of the hands of abusers, or helping to fund inclusive shelters, your voice and your actions matter. But let's be real. Progress is so slow, and sometimes it feels like we're fighting an uphill battle through the snow, uphill both ways. But as history has shown us, when women come together, we get shit done. So let's keep going. If you or someone you know needs help, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24/7 at 1-800-799-7233. That's it for this episode of Bitchy History. If you enjoyed the show, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe, review, and share it with someone who loves history as much as we do. Until next time, stay curious and keep questioning the world around you.
History. History. What a bitch, right?